our next speaker, I'd like to welcome onto this virtual stage Beáta Kovács, who will be talking about empowerment in action, moving from culture clash to modern product management culture. Bea has spent the last decade working in various industries. Most recently, she was head of product for the not-for-profit division of the Access Group UK. Today, she works with product managers and startups to improve their product practice. Welcome on board, Bea.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is very exciting. So let me begin. My name is Beáta Kovács. I'm from Hungary, Budapest, but actually I moved to the UK 5 years ago and I live in Brighton now. I'm here today to talk to you about influencing and changing product cultures in software companies. I spent my last decade working on software products, mostly in various roles and various companies and various industries. And as you heard, I'm now a product coach. I work with product leaders mostly and product teams, helping them increase their impact and figure out what their culture and sometimes their org charts should look like. I'm also in the process of building a product-led startup. We're currently in stealth mode, but I hope to introduce it to the world soon. So when I started working on software now a decade ago, I didn't really have an idea about what a product manager does. It was common to have project and delivery managers assigned to dev teams, but product management was business focused and very, very commercial. Agile or Scrum were concepts only used by developers, and everything was a lot more project and business case driven. In the engineering world, we had Agile, but everything else was the old, well-tested waterfall. You could argue now a lot has changed since, especially for established companies and industries, but trust me, it's a whole new world out there for people working in product. Also, best practices in product development look very different from today. Empowered cross-functional product teams are now disrupting industries. Small teams and startups with diverse set of skills and perspectives are beating well-funded giants stuck in their old ways of thinking. The same way Netflix beat Blockbuster, the Fortune 500 list is full of technology and tech-enabled companies slowly but surely killing off competitors who didn't move fast enough. And we're still at the start line here. Just think about Hopin and now and how we no longer have to travel to conferences, or how Netflix is now competing with Hollywood and became one of the biggest global content creators, while only 15 years ago, they were posting DVDs to people. When companies get their product mindset right, technology becomes a true accelerator. And when they are able to pair that with a strong culture, they can literally take over the world. However, especially in Europe, we're still in a phase where the CPO title more often means Chief People Officer than Product Officer on company boards. And there's a lot of confusion around what the ideal org chart looks like. Based on the progress so far, it will definitely take some time before we can declare a true mindset shift on a more global scale in products. But don't get me wrong, there are some truly product-led companies out there already. Unfortunately, the majority is still in Silicon Valley or in other US startup hubs like New York. And the industry is still figuring out what a digital product-led business model means in the long run and how it scales operationally and with global markets. The good news for all of us in product is that according to OpenView, product-led companies are valued more than 30% higher than traditional technology businesses. And as consumers and businesses become more and more reliant on technology and software, adopting modern product practices becomes a competitive advantage. But product-led doesn't automatically mean it's a healthy product culture. It only means that the product is even more critical to the success of the business. So product teams are now under even more pressure and scrutiny. In a lot of companies I worked with or for, the root cause of the product team's daily problems was the conflict between the short and long-term thinking. Short-term thinking looks like a very important prospect or an important customer who needs a solution today or preferably yesterday. It's a competitor who just released a new thing, so we need to copy it immediately, regardless of what was on the roadmap. There's a lot of urgency when we need to make decisions about the almost now. And when it comes to the next 12 months, businesses often trick themselves into thinking there's enough time to figure that out. Before consumer technology and software became so ingrained in our lives, business context took a lot longer to change. Today, anyone can launch a competitive product relatively cheaply and easily. and the rules of competition have massively changed for digital products and services. Business leaders will eventually need to understand how to shift their mindset to become more agile. It hasn't happened in a lot of industries yet, and it might take a new generation of leaders before we see mass adoption of real agile or product mindsets rather than focusing on fancy slogans for digital transformation. But for now, if you find yourself in a situation like this, just know it's normal and it's not you. The good news is that if you work in a product team, you're in a really good place to help your company accelerate, just like it happened to me and our teams in my first product role. Just to be absolutely transparent with you, changing your company's culture is a difficult thing to do. But if you focus on the right things and you use your product mindset, you can achieve meaningful results. You will need to be prepared to advocate and evangelize and to show leadership without anyone giving you titles or permission. But if you get it right, your impact on your product and company won't be ignored. When I got into my first proper product role, I still had no idea about what product management is or how it's different from the traditional waterfall project management approaches. The company had an IT-style development center with a bunch of extremely smart engineers. We worked in quarterly cycles aligned with business planning and had a massive process to plan, execute, and ultimately launch new ideas. Our engineers didn't really like this setup. They usually got upset about top-down requirements, claimed half of the ideas were impossible to implement, and got on with the rest. We also had a lot of customers and users, but no real idea of what they thought about our software. To be honest, there was quite a lot of frustration, tons of very complicated process, and a lot of back conflict. And as we started to learn about modern product management, we also realized that this is not the only way to go about things, and we desperately wanted everyone else around us to feel and think the same. From our perspective, we've been working extremely hard to upskill ourselves. We've established important processes for discovery and delivery and worked tirelessly to meet deadlines and releases. We also developed some product ego along the way. Proud of how we are more mature now, following everything we read in books and articles about best practices of product management. But despite all of our efforts, the overall culture didn't get better. It actually got worse. And we had no idea why people were not listening. We had no idea why we only ended up in bigger and bigger arguments as time went on. I think I know now, but it was quite impossible to know back then. We've been simply focusing on the wrong problems. We wanted the business to stop micromanage us, and we demanded understanding, instead of using our product mindset and skills to bridge the gap between us and them. If you want to transform your culture, you need to forget about mission statements and power grabs. Those won't make any situation better. Ultimately, there's always someone with more power or a misaligned incentive. And even if everyone's aligned, product's job is to make predictions about the future and use that information to make decisions that potentially have long-lasting impact. These types of discussions are always hard and necessary, regardless of how progressive your company's product culture is. We learned that the only way to truly transform the culture, excuse me, we learned that the only way to truly transform culture for the better is to use empathy and influence and focus on closing the gap. With experience, I've learned that the biggest difference between great and not so great cultures is how people feel after a difficult conversation. Having a great culture doesn't mean there's no conflict or everyone is always happy with every decision. Quite the contrary. If you're familiar with the concepts around high-performing teams, you'll know that diversity and differences in perspectives are essential building blocks of long-term success. Your goal can't be to make conflict disappear or be responsible for all the decisions. These might be shiny objects you think would change your life, but they won't. If anything, they create bias and increase risk. And as product people, we need to know better and find the right way to think about what meaningful collaboration looks like. We need to aim for a better shared understanding if we want to transform how we work together. And we need to lead the way so people understand what we mean by that. I don't want to spend too much time on the actual definition of culture, but there's a fundamentally important clue in this wording from Wikipedia. Culture has a dual perspective. It's the norms we hold as a group on how we work together, but we can't ignore the impact of the individual and their behavior. Culture is what people do and don't do. And the stronger the expectations based on the group norms and the individual perspectives, the more likely we will experience culture clash. It's not because anyone is a particularly bad actor. It's just one of those human things. The solution is not to rewrite the norms, like change a process. That doesn't mean an automatic improvement in culture. But if we can align norms, expectations, and individual behaviors, the risk of culture clash becomes a lot smaller. As an example, if there's no trust between leadership and the product team, the culture will be based on micromanagement, templates, and overcomplicated process. The targets are handed down to the PM a day before the news cycle kicks in, less time for the team to come up with objections, and often it feels you're fighting people over the decision you didn't even subscribe to. And as a response, product teams often push back as hard as they can or pretend it's not happening and try to avoid risky or difficult conversations. Eventually, there's no real ownership or buy-in, and these behaviors always lead to more culture clash on the long run. Culture clash is a dangerous phenomenon. It often becomes extremely personal very quickly. It's personal because how we behave and see the world is rooted in our personal values. And when things get personal, a lot of norms break down. Those are the situations where bridges get burned and people get fired. I remember some professional conversations where I was unable to explain how a situation escalated so quickly. But in the moment, I had no idea why it's happening, and I had absolutely no way to escape or refuse it. The more it happens, the more likely it is to lead to the us and them mentality, product versus the business or product versus sales. It doesn't happen because the people involved are bad. It happens because we have different perspectives, and these perspectives result in different expectations. And we need to learn how to talk about these differences in a more constructive way, as opposed to just demanding the other party to see our point of view and agree to our conclusion. Because of this, if you want to get your culture closer to the ideal blueprint, you need to look at it as a long-term investment plan. The bigger the gap between the current and the ideal, the more your mindset and approach matters. It's ironic, but the more successful, well-established your company is, the more difficult it can be for the leaders to see dysfunction and the need for change. But even in those circumstances, I urge all of you not to give up just yet. If you're passionate about doing the right things, you will find a lot of opportunities to have a positive impact on your organization. Just make sure you stay focused on the right approach and mindset, and don't get busy solving the wrong problems. The easiest is always start where you are. If you follow the happy path of product with research, opportunities, solutions, and experiments, the mindset will keep you on the right path no matter what. And if you feel slightly lost, just remind yourself to get back to your product thinking, using those frameworks to help you ask slightly different questions as you go. And above everything else, there's only one thing that's fundamentally and generally true for all domain, industry, and size. When it comes to culture, your main focus needs to be on the people and the interactions between them. Without trust and relationship, there's only empty process. Because culture is what people do, your main goal should be to understand and influence people in your organization. That's why soft skills are so important for any product manager or team. They directly influence the culture and build or destroy trust. Empathy and great stakeholder management skills are crucial for anyone who's trying to steer their organization in a new direction, because you're looking to change people's beliefs and behaviors. The stronger your relationships, the more likely you'll have the support and influence that you need. On the other side, empathy, self-awareness, and trust-led interpersonal relationships can also prevent cultures from becoming toxic. To get to a better place internally, you need to apply a continuous improvement mindset on these topics. If you've ever experienced a digital transformation project or your company trying to blindly copy another organization's model, I'm looking at all of you folks adopting the Spotify model, you know what I'm talking about. Just because we're doing things differently doesn't mean anything gets better. If we constantly change everything about the what and the how can we know what's really working and what is only a waste of time? But if we approach it through the lens of our product mindset, picking up on signals of culture clash and using product discovery and research methods to dig deep and understand before we act, we can learn more about what matters. And we have a real chance of coming up with solutions that move us closer to the desired outcomes. Because culture is just as complex as any other product problem, it's important to find a way to break it down into smaller areas. This is definitely not the only way to think about organizations and ways of working, but this model helps me every time I need to structure my thinking and explain to others where I'm at in my head. In general, frameworks and tools are incredibly useful for any kind of thinking. And the more abstract and complex your topic, like thinking about long-term implications and complex systems of people around you, the more important it is to be able to find ways to make your thinking more explicit. It's not about which tool or framework you use. It's more about the principle of breaking complexity down and finding ways to create a better understanding around you. In my model, the first pillar is people, the who. There's a tweet from Brad Gresiak, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name not properly. The two hardest things in computer science are people and convincing others that people is the hardest thing in computer science. It doesn't matter what your job or role is. As long as you work for a company, you work for and with people. If you need things to change, you need to start there. The easiest way to get to better outcomes is to improve your relationships across your business, especially in a role like product, where direct authority doesn't exist and your influence is the only political currency you have. The second pillar is clarity and context. It's the why. It's not only important because it provides motivation and purpose, although these are very important aspects and they are required for building great cultures and high performance. But without clarity, there's no delegation, no empowerment, no vision, no strategy, and ultimately no alignment. When businesses and teams are not clear on their why, process becomes the only way of collaboration, and people who care get quickly demotivated. Several studies show that high performance and job satisfaction are directly linked to this feeling of human personal connection. But without a shared purpose, people struggle to feel connected. The third pillar is collaboration. It's process and the interactions between people. It's the how and the what, not necessarily in terms of the actual organizational cause, but more in terms of what behaviors get rewarded, prioritized, or ignored. Often when we feel friction or collaboration breaking down, we jump to change this third pillar. We hope that if we change the process, the problem will go away. But in the cases I've seen, it's rarely the process alone that makes or breaks the culture. It's more how people show up, what their reality looks like, and how that reality translates into actions and expectations within the context of working together. Replacing a broken process with another broken process won't improve outcomes for anyone, just like lengthy, complex processes won't guarantee perfect results or flawless execution. Only when we look at all the three pillars together can we get a more coherent view of reality and understand what real options we can and should take. And because of this, I always start and advise teams to prioritize the first two pillars and only move to the what and the how once there's enough context to ensure we're looking at the right opportunities and understand how to think about better outcomes. A word of caution here. Just like when you work on your products, you need to be really good at catching bias, be it yours or someone else's. There are no silver bullets to improve product or company cultures. If there would be one right way to do it, someone would already be very rich and you wouldn't be listening to me. Find the tools that help you ask the right questions. Find the tools that highlight bias and avoid jumping to easy conclusions. When you're getting started working on your culture, you'll need to be able to aim at something, but in a way that doesn't create more bias and risk. This is where principles come handy. They help you describe an outcome without the need to add too much detail too early. As you go, you get more and more insights to clarify the details. But when you're at the starting point, it's better to look for direction rather than trying to describe an exact destination. That's another reason why replacing company process might only make things worse. Process creates constraints and doesn't help exploration. The last piece of general advice is something I assume already know, but it's always good to double check and remind all of us. Without focus, there's no real impact. Product teams generally fight hundreds of fires every day, and these types of culture problems will be the last on any company's priority list if they don't hurt the business outcomes directly. So if you want to change your culture, you'll need to find ways to prioritize it against all other demands on you. And even then, you most likely won't be able to afford to spend 20% of your overall time on the topic. So to have an impact, you need to focus and prioritize. You need to find ways to quickly separate important questions and problems from the noise. It's not an easy thing to do, but if you can figure out what's worth addressing and how, people will never want to go back to the ways that it was before. To help you get started, I wanted to share some ideas you can start working on even tomorrow. You can treat these like a cheat sheet, and much rather a cheat sheet than a list of activities to complete. As I said earlier, I always focus on the relationships and the people first. And as we don't really have power over the wider organization, anything you do to improve your stakeholder relationships creates more opportunity for improvement. Make sure you optimize for inclusive, diverse collaboration. The more you understand about others, the more likely you'll succeed on the long run. For a meaningful cultural improvement, it's not enough to cultivate your one-to-one relationships. You also need to make sure everyone is looking in the same direction and understands how they contribute to the bigger picture. Communication is a crucial part of your culture. The better your organization is in sharing context or insights or information, the less friction and clash you can expect. To ensure your efforts are focused on changing the right process, focus on what helps you create more clarity and alignment internally. Make sure you understand what's signal and what's noise and how others prefer to engage with you. Communication only happens when both parties are actively engaged. Stay away from overwhelming people with useless information and focus on increasing value. And when it comes to process, you should look at it like the phase of your solution discovery. You start with hypothesis or small experiments, have a definition of the desired outcome. You make it collaborative, you make it inclusive, at least as much as you can. And you only move to the execution when you have enough evidence that it does create value. And you also know what meaningful results look like. Changing processes, especially if they are shared, complex, and deeply ingrained in your company culture, is very expensive and it carries a lot of risk. But if you use your product mindset and the tools to understand the root causes and you mitigate risk, you have a better chance of delivering meaningful, positive change for all of the people around you. So to change your culture, remember the principles. Think about the people, think about how you can use empathy, and think about how long you have. I really hope you found these ideas and suggestions useful, and you are now all inspired to get working on your culture. As I said, there are no real silver bullets that will guarantee ultimate success. But as long as you're grounded in the right approach and principles, I'm sure you'll find the right way that works in your context. And now, before I close my talk, I wanted to share a quote with all of you from the person who's behind the Spotify model. I find it very, very important to highlight that before we demand that others change their approach and their behavior, we need to lead the way and help others to follow. Culture is the sum of everyone's attitude and actions. So model the behavior you want to see. That was all from me today. I really hope we have some questions, and do let me know how everything around culture change worked out for you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that interesting talk, Beata. Just like to remind everyone to head over to the Q&A tab, start adding your questions. While everyone does that, I'll take a moment to show off the gift, which we'll be giving you as a thanks for the great talk which you've just given. Thank you so much. So,
thank you.
Kicking off with questions, I am curious if you can think back to any particular experiments you ran on tweaking the culture around you or your teams, and maybe think about a particularly surprisingly successful one, and one which you thought would really work to improve culture, but unfortunately did not.
Okay, well, there was a really, really exciting project that we've been involved with. And I have to say this, it wasn't necessarily me, it was a result of a lot of thinking around how we can manage the stakeholders in our business much better. So we always had a lot of friction around planning, and I guess that's something that every product team has, because the business needs to know 6 months in advance what you're going to deliver, because that's how marketing is planning, and that's how much time they need to create the sales brochures and just prepare for everything. But when you work in product, you don't really know the exact details of everything that you're going to deliver 6 months from now. And the real problem wasn't necessarily that we couldn't tell people what we're going to do. It was that they didn't really understand the implications of things changing and how quickly we can get to a point of, yes, everything is on track, but actually 2 weeks later, we have to realize that we won't be able to meet the deadlines. And on the other side, they were also frustrated because they felt that we didn't really share openly the progress that we made. And so they didn't have an idea when we were inside the cycle, inside the development cycle, on what we were actually working on. So there was a lot of this type of conflict of the business asking us, what are you working on? And us telling them, well, we're working on the things that you asked us to work on. And then they were like, okay, and what's your progress? And we said, well, this is how far we've got. So anyway, our lovely leader or manager, Laszlo, he came up with an idea that actually turned into a huge, beautiful project, an internal tool. And it was a stakeholder management tool. It was, how should I describe it? It was a dashboard, basically a status dashboard, where we had consistently visualized the progress the product teams have made within the development cycle in a way that was understandable for the business. But we never used Jira tickets, we never used burn down charts, we never used anything that is traditionally being used in project management to show this progress. It was a different approach. It was incredibly visual. And the good thing about that was that everyone knew where to find it. So people stopped coming to us asking for all of those details. They stopped bugging us about the progress and about what we were working on, because all the work was visible to them, and it was literally a URL that they could go to and get an immediate understanding of what's getting released, what's going to get delayed, what the progress looks like. When it comes to the failed experiments, well, we had many, and this dashboard was one of those ones that started as an Excel sheet driven process, I think. And we had to iterate ourselves through it. We had to work with the stakeholders consistently. We had many versions of the visualization that didn't work out. simply because it gave the wrong idea to the people who were looking at it. So it was all about making sure that when we come up with these ideas around how we want the process to change, we actually went to the people who had to change their behavior in order for the process to be different.
Great examples, thanks. I find that, or I like to think that a lot of the ways we build up trust as people kind of evolved and are pretty reliant on face-to-face communication as a result of that. I've often seen that already start to break down in companies with multiple offices. That's maybe an older challenge we had, but of course, we've all been thrust into a pretty big change over the past year and a half. Do you have any particular tips that kind of evolved out of this new situation on how to maintain trust with stakeholders?
Well, I think first of all, we have all of the old tools, stakeholder interviews, stakeholder management, different types of meetings and conversations. I think we just need to shift those into more online conversations. But on top of everything that we've been already doing, I think the biggest thing that we all can do in product is use the collaboration tools that we already have. So when we were planning the roadmap with my last team, when I was a head of product for the not-for-profit division, we did it in Miro, I think. But it doesn't even matter what kind of tool you use. It can be any whiteboard in Microsoft Teams, or it can be a Google document. The key thing in that one was that it was shared with all of the stakeholders when we started the planning. We taught people how to read it. We helped them understand what the progress looked like, and they had access to it. So as we, the product team, worked on the validation and we added more and more insight and detail, every single time they wanted to know where we are, we just told them to go back and look at the same thing because everything is there. And it did two things. One, we were absolutely in control of the information that we wanted to share, because we added the information to the whiteboard and we were able to tell people how to read it. But the second thing was people didn't feel that we're hiding information from them. They felt like we are being completely forthcoming, which was the reality of it, because it was the same thing that we worked on. The only thing I want to say to everyone, if you work with collaboration tools and you are thinking about sharing this with the wider organization, always do it, but make sure that whatever you have in there, you're comfortable with, because people sometimes take screenshots and they sometimes take the information and use it in a different context, and they don't necessarily tell you before they do that. So just make sure that whatever you put in there, whatever you share, is something that you know about and you are happy with being shared in a bigger conversation.
Everyone should be happy having their roadmaps be tweeted, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally. Chilla asked a question here. Did you have situations where there was a good solution for a problem, but people resisted the change so much that they did not want to try it? How did you respond to the situation? Do you have any advice?
Always. It happens. Every time you propose something, people will say no, because nobody wants to change what they are doing. They don't want things to be different. It's so comfortable to be where you are, isn't it? The best advice I can give is to try to find ways to make it easier for people to adopt the new practices, the new behaviors, anything you can do. Try to break it down into smaller pieces. Like if you know that the whole process needs to change, try to figure out if you can change just one step. And try to find ways to show them what's in it for them. In a lot of cases, people don't necessarily recognize that it's their best interest as well to adapt and to change what they're doing. So if you can find ways to show that to people, and maybe invite them in without asking them to subscribe to the whole process and just test it and see it for themselves, those kind of things can help getting buy-in.
How much of this kind of mindset or like cultural seed is something which you think needs to be hired for when building up a product team versus something which, as a product leader, you're able to focus on helping people develop, and how do you go about that?
That's a really good question. I don't like hiring for culture fit. When I'm a hiring manager, I'm trying to hire people where I see the passion, and that passion needs to be there to learn. I think the most important thing in product is to be able to stay curious and to be able to empathize with people and to let go of your own perspective and try to figure out what other people think and feel. And if I see that in people, then I think those people tend to become really good product managers. In a lot of cases, when you're trying to hire for culture, it's quite easy to rig the game, especially if you publish your values and you publish your ways of working. It's quite easy for anyone to show up and pretend that they are the right people. They already share all of your values. And also, don't forget, it's not necessarily about finding people who are similar to you. The more diverse a team is, the more different the experience is, the more chances we have that we can do awesome things together, and we're going to catch bias, and we're going to have a very diverse way of looking at the world.
Gabor Torek asks, how would you win the heart and mind of people at different levels in a command and control culture organization to be more inclusive and empowering?
Oh, it's difficult, but one of the things that always worked for me is to try to find sponsors. And sponsors are different from just stakeholders. If you can find one or two people who share your mindset, who share your perspective and have power as well within the organization, then those small seeds that you can plant with those people can actually then turn out to be culture transforming processes and culture transforming ideas. I would say that if you have command and control, then it's really difficult to do it without having powerful allies in your leadership team. So that would be my first thing, trying to find people who share my perspective and gain some influence through them.
Sir, a question from Daniel here. What if the teams are willing to make changes and also realize the problems, but management were not cooperative because of the everyday problem that was more important? And part two to that is, and if the train is leaving slowly, you know if you're not addressing a problem.
Yeah, so, well, this is difficult. We need to find the value and we need to prove that there is value in change. What we also need to understand is that changing culture or changing process, because most of the time culture change ends up in process change as well, it is quite expensive. So we can't just show up on someone's doorstep and say, we know better. And that's what I meant by, if management doesn't buy in, then try to find areas where you don't need the permission of management, and try to look into ways of generating some evidence, some value for your senior leadership team, to show them that the thinking, the new way of thinking or the new processes that you would like to see are actually valuable. In a lot of cases, what you can definitely prove is that we change our engineering approach, or we changed how we do product research, and look, these are all of the awesome results that we get out of it. You won't need senior leadership to approve necessarily how you run your internal processes. And if you can start there, or you can find a teeny tiny project that is not too risky for the business and try your new ways of approaching it there, then you can gather some evidence. And with that evidence, you can have different conversations.
Thank you. And finally, I'm curious how, for example, in the dashboard which you mentioned, how you find communication with business stakeholder varies when trying out an approach which is more focused on the output of the product teams versus being more focused on the outcomes which you're trying to drive for the business or customers. Have you seen any successes or failures of either approach?
I think that anyone who works in product long enough, especially if you have direct relationships with your senior stakeholders, with the senior leaders of the business, you recognize that you need to play the game. If you don't speak the language of the senior team, then you won't get hurt. So every time I'm trying to influence leadership or I'm trying to influence a culture change, I always start by trying to understand where they are coming from and what the language is that they understand. And then as we start working together and as we start build that trust up, there is a lot of opportunities for the product team to come in and educate and try to change the ways of conversation and try to change how we talk about the future and how we talk about the things that we are here to deliver. But ultimately, I think if you work in product, as much as we want to think that words matter, words really don't matter. You can talk about outputs to the senior leadership team. If you don't give them all of the detail, if you phrase it the right way, they can be also framed as outcomes for the team. So I don't think that there is a big necessity there to change everything about how the business thinks or how they talk to product or how they want to manage the communication. I think we need to get a lot more empathetic. And what we shouldn't forget is that all of those people around us sitting in the boardrooms, they are specialists in their areas. They have their jobs, they have their daily responsibilities. They are not product people. We can't expect them to learn the mindset, to learn the language, to become experts in how to do this thing. So every time you find yourself thinking about, oh, why do I have to talk about output? And why do I have to give them the roadmap? And why do I have to make commitments? Well, it's because that's how we can collaborate. Use your empathy and try to figure out how you can talk to people and how you can make promises and how you can talk to the business in a way that doesn't create negative impact for your team. And that's where the real culture change will happen.